Hi, well, welcome to this presentation by Jinny Yu, Artist in Residence. It's really wonderful to have Jinny here after a couple of years of rescheduling due to you know what. So Jinny's here from Ottawa, and she splits her time between Ottawa and Berlin. We got talking a couple of years ago about a residency, particularly the research phase of a residency that would eventually end up in some form of exhibition here. So I'm really glad that Jinny was able to come and do the research at this point. So welcome to everybody. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that BoxoPROJECTS is located on the lands of the Chemehuevi, the Serrano, and the Cahuilla people, and invite you at home to consider the land that you are on. So thank you again, as I said, for being here. This is the next phase in a long-term project that she's doing that she'll talk to you about. She'll talk to you both about her general practice and then how this pertains to a project called Perpetual Guest that she's been working on for many years and presented. And we're hoping that in the not too distant future, we'll be able to show work here by Jinny that is the outcome of this residency. When we first got talking, I think my understanding of Jinny's project had to do with delineating ownership of land and the dislocation of Indigenous people. But ever since she's been here, I've understood that the project is aimed really more at us finding a way of cohabitating together. And I'm really interested in what Jinny has to say and in the project. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jinny. I just wanted to also acknowledge the California Arts Council, which has partially funded this project, and the Canadian Arts Council, which has funded Jinny's residency.
So hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's really nice to meet you. I'm going to try to make it not too long so that you don't have to keep standing up, but I would like to say a few things. So bear with me for a little. You to engage in conversations, perhaps as a group or individually after, or if you have any questions while I'm speaking, then please feel free to just, ask. Spending a month here in a very, in an amazing setting, as you all very well know. And I would like to also maybe thank you, Bernard, for hosting me. Also Canada Council for the Arts, and a few people that I had a chance to meet and talk to while I was doing my research here. And it's Lori Martinez from Malki Museum, Robert Plaza from the Native American Land Conservancy, Ian Chadwick from Joshua Tree National Park, and also, Sarah Bliss from the 29 Palms of Mission Indian band. And so I've had sort of like, I came with this question of how this park, Joshua Tree National Park, came to be property of the United States. And so, I'm just scratching the surface of the long history of this land and learned a little bit about what happened before the colonization as well. But I'll kind of come back to what the kind of thought sketch and this physical sketch that I'm presenting to you to just share. So this is a project that I did presented at the Venice Biennale in 2015. And it's called Don't They Ever Stop Migrating. And it is a time when I was invited to present this exhibition, and it was at the time of a so-called migration crisis in Europe. This was the invasion of Syria, and a lot of people from the Middle East and North Africa coming to the doorstep of Europe, and Europe panicking. And so I wanted to somehow kind of engage the viewers who will be coming to this discussion of fear of the other that we all have as human beings and as like sentient beings, and that how we define the other. And I came as I knew I was going to crowd, people in the art world who pride ourselves of being open-minded, of being very liberal, and so on, which also kind of leads to polarization of, our society, where we are unable to speak to the other side, which unfortunately has gotten worse since then. But I wanted to kind of engage myself and also engage me with viewers with this discussion of how do we define the other, and do we all, to kind of myself admit that I also have fear of the other, whatever the other I define is. And this is, so I'd like to maybe give you a little bit of intro of who I am. So I was born in South Korea. I immigrated to Montreal with my parents when I was 12. When I grew up in Korea, I was born in 76. So from 76 to 88, I was in Korea. This was during, Cold War. And we did have military drill, South Korea being capitalistic and democratic versus the communist North. We did have fear of the other. Not only of the communists, but also because it was a very homogeneous culture and ethnicity. And so we did have fear of the other. And I know what it means to have fear of the other because I grew up in that culture and I was the minority in that culture. And then having immigrated to Canada, of course, I am a visible minority. So I also understood what it means to be the other. And that was, a little bit of shock. And, I've been through many kind of culture identity crises in my life, but that was one of the first. And so having experienced both the side of being the other and not, I wanted to kind of question myself, having these two sides in me, question myself in where does this fear of the other come from? How do I define the other? And acknowledge that I do have that fear of the other as well. And so then we almost have it because I'm a human and all that idea. And so what I did was to, so this is like an oratory, a small church that is now being used as an exhibition space. And I painted these brush strokes on a large sheet of cloth that became like a box that dropped in the space. And I wanted to kind of think about this idea of also mass, this when something foreign or something that I don't know, like such as brushstrokes, surpass certain threshold, then we have this kind of a little bit of fear when it's, one is exotic, mass is threatening. And so I wanted to kind of think about that idea and also kind of movement of people and all that. And then it was also presented in Canada, where I had this kind of an antechamber here in that space in between the entrance and the work itself, which kind of meant to represent maybe the ocean that we have in Canada and immigration policy, refugee policy, that kind of prevents that kind of immediate confrontation with the migration crisis, at least in Canada it is. And so I would like to show you a video that also includes So I had sort of a sound that was accompanying my painting, and so I wanted to show you that. And then I'll unmute, and you can mute. And then I'll put up down, and I'll start it.
Around here, you don't think there's something going around, do you? What's happening? Think you're the cause. What?
Was this in the desk, you know?
Yes.
This is it, representing Korea?
No,
I think you're the cause. Why? I think you're around here. I don't know why. Sitting around here debating. Crash that window. Who are you? What are you?
So you get the idea. And so this was one of the collateral exhibitions at the Venice Biennale, so not representing countries, and hosted by Nova Icona. And so this sound clip is something that I wove together, taking from the movie The Birds by Hitchcock. If you remember the reaction of different characters in the movie to the other being the birds, it's very representative of our reaction as a society and of Europe as well towards migration crisis, so-called migration crisis. And so I kind of took 10 lines from the movie, such as where did it come from? It's all your fault. Kind of lines that kind of represents our reaction, and kind of wove it in the way that I wove my brushstrokes in the work. So this was kind of me thinking about this position of minority and majority, this question of other, and so it's kind of a self-portrait in a way. And the title, Don't They Ever Stop Migrating, is also taken from the movie. It's a line by a character. And so that I wanted to sort of show this as a background of what I do, what I did. And then I would like to show you the work that Bernard has seen, that he invited me to this residency. Is this what you see in your, okay, great. And so this is called, this is the work Perpetual Guest. In 2017, Canada celebrated its 150th anniversary as a country, as a project. And at that time, I started to think about this two poles of colonizers and colonizers within that since the project, and trying to find out where do I fit? And my work in general is really kind of some kind of self-portrait. It had been some kind of self-portraiture. So trying to kind of find out who I am, what am I doing here? You know, those kind of large philosophical questions. And so at that point, I was wondering, where do I fit within this equation, within this spectrum? And so that was kind of the starting question. And then as I started to kind of understand that I was living on Algonquin and Anishinaabe land as a settler, and I started to understand as an immigrant, I am part of the colonial project. I was invited by uninvited guests to come and live on the unceded land of Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Ironically, the capital of Canada being Ottawa, being on unceded, unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin people's land. And so I sort of started to think about what that means and how I feel about that. And so this is the kind of the result of first thought about how I feel. They are painted on glass. Oh, sorry. So when you enter the exhibition, you see this land acknowledgement. I wanted to start the exhibition by shifting the gaze from this way, looking kind of being vertical to horizontal, have this kind of relationship between kind of getting to know where I'm standing and where I'm walking. And so on the floor, it says, Jinny Yu, invité perpétuel successeur non cédé de la nation Algonquin Anishinaabe, which means perpetual guest on these unceded land of Algonquin Anishinaabe nations. And so you enter the exhibition like this. And then I have 9 panels that are basically paintings on glass, and they're untempered glass. And so you can feel that it could break. And they are held by these aluminum cylinders that are about 4 inches long, some of which are distanced in the same sort of similar distance as our human eyes are. So I kind of wanted to sort of think about people who have gone before us, sort of looking at us, and me feeling uneasy being looked at, and me feeling kind of uneasy, really uncomfortable, but also not really having any choice but to live there for now. And so this is what Bernard was saying about this onus being on the settlers to find a solution to cohabitate together, because we're really kind of here as uninvited guests. And so there are 9 panels. They're just a painting of a square. It's nothing more than just square on a rectangle, and of different tones. There are 3 tones. And so this was also presented in a couple of different places. This was in Montreal, which is the land of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And so then I also sort of made I wanted it to be very specific. The specificity of the land was very important for me. And so I kind of put that on the floor like this. And it was presented with another body of work that I had done prior to this series called Why Does Its Lock Fit My Key? It's a line from Toni Morrison's book called Home. And it's kind of reversing the power relationship. Key fitting the hole, or lock fitting the key, or key fitting the lock. So this questioning. So I thought it was kind of a nice, and the curator as well, Cheryl Sim, thought it was a good sort of combination of projects. So we presented this within a larger exhibition called Relations, Diaspora and Painting. That included many artists, including Frank Bowling and Julie Meritu and so on and so forth. Really honored to be part of that. And so this is kind of the kind of perpetual guest project that I began with. And then I'm going to show you now a video where I'm talking in the video, and which is kind of something that I did after having done the perpetual guest, which conclusion to me was that basically I'm a settler. I have no victimhood to claim. I am a settler. And so that's one conclusion. And then right. So I'll show you this video, which is a project that I did after Perpetual Guest. And I'm going to unmute and put the volume up.
Work that I did during the lockdown is called Oat. It's a series of 42 drawings that I did since last April when the lockdown started. It was, hard time, confusing time, stressful time for everybody. And I started to just, make one drawing a day. It was really rather helpful for me to have this kind of daily task that I could accomplish, and just to get through the whole stress and shock of it all. The idea behind this series called Oat comes out of my previous series called Perpetual Guest. It was a series of painting installation where I was exploring what it means for me to live here as a settler immigrant on the unceded territory of Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. I was invited by the colonial power to come and settle here. I was not invited by the original inhabitants of this land, the real host. So I am an unwelcomed guest of an unwelcomed guest. And so in that series, I was thinking about this feeling of unsettledness, feeling of not really precariousness, but always feeling like I must be very careful because I'm a guest of a guest on this land. And that kind of led me to think about the sense of responsibility that guests and hosts have, and the problematics of limited sense of responsibility that guests can have or can think that they have. And so I wanted to think about these established positions of guest and host. And so I started this series thinking about these three words: can guest host, can host guest, guest can host can guest. And so I started to take this notion and took this idea of door, this motif of door, and started to draw. And when I first started to draw, it was fairly clearly defined positions of guest and host. And as I kept going, it started to become a little bit more complicated and more complex. And so they became gray on gray. And this idea, this revelation thing came when I fell upon this word, hôte, which in French can mean guest as well as host. And I thought it was a perfect title for this idea of thinking about guest and host and sharing of responsibility as everybody who's living here on this land. And so the doors become gray on gray wall, and they started to kind of open up a little bit. And and it was important for me that these drawings were presented in sequence. This book was made with the help of Xenia Fink and Anne Deuter in Berlin. And so this is how it ends. And this is what I did during the lockdown. So that is what I did during the lockdown. This is a project that I usually sort of wrap up a project when I have resolved. Oh, right, yes. So I usually wrap up a project when I have resolved some kind of question that I began the project with. And so this project, for example,
I had the question of can guest host, can host guest, this kind of like relationship between host and guest being questioning that clearly defined positioning of guest and host and problematizing it because, guests have, even if I acknowledge that I'm a guest here, guests have a rather limited sense of responsibility to where we are. So for example, I'm not, going to pay state taxes of BoxoPROJECTS while guesting here. I think this idea of guesting also could lead to exploitation of the land in the sense that if I don't belong to this land, then I have less stake in taking care of it or so on. But of course, it is controversial for a guest like me, and like I think a lot of us here in this room, to claim the because we're not. And so this is kind of this fraught question that I still haven't resolved even after having finished the book. And so it kind of ends because, it ends, but it's a questioning that I brought here as well. And so now I'm going to present you this very, very rough sketch that is absolutely not resolved. And they're just ideas that are floating around from things that I've learned since I got here and things that I felt. So this is kind of a physical sketch that I have here. Some notions that kind of float in my head these days after my stay here is this notion of property, notion of sovereignty, sovereign nation-to-nation relationship. But of course, there is the domestic dependent nation idea as well, which is problematic. How to resolve it, I don't know. I mean, if I knew, then it would be solved by now. But I think, so there's those kinds of ideas, as well as this idea of organized entity, large organized entity versus smaller organized entities, breaking up of those organized entities. And I'm thinking about tribal tribes here, larger organized entity being nation states, US in this case only, but I think it could be extended to other things. And then I was also kind of thinking about not only about the kind of the history of this land and the different acts, statutes and acts and policies that came to make this Joshua National Park into being, and the kind of history of course, homesteading and mining, and this desire to conserve and preserve. So very multiple layers of people trying to do different things. But always one thing seems to remain constant is the land appropriation, sort of it being taken away from the original inhabitants. Although I do think that from what my research, and I'm just doing my, I'm on the surface, as I said, it seems to be reversing slowly. I mean, this week, we did hear this news of what's the Sinkion tribes that have worked with the intertribal Sinkion and the Save the Woods League for land, and then giving back to the stewardship of the Sinkion tribes. And so, and also the Native American Land Conservancy doing similar things as well. And so I think it is kind of now, we're kind of understanding a little bit of the history and trying to do something, but it's very, very, very tiny. The land that belongs to the Native Americans here in the state is 2%. It used to be 100%, so it's quite very little. And so this idea, so, you know, I'm just scratching the surface in terms of history, but I was thinking about this idea of breaking up, how this idea of sovereignty, how can one maintain one's sovereignty as it's being kind of eaten up or broken down. And then of course I did some hikes, you know, and looking at these rocks, which for you, it will be like, you know, a bit of a cliche that I talk about this, but you know, how they're put together is so amazing. But I learned that, of course, it's not being put together, it's like falling apart. And so this idea of like entropy, how things are basically falling apart until there's like this great force that melts everything away. And then kind of, does it then become like one again, like volcanic activity, and then it becomes to break again. So this kind of idea of sovereignty, property, and things like that is kind of in my head. And as I said, nothing resolved, but the reason why I started to think about property is because I felt it when I got here, that the sense of property is so important here. It's really guarded, this either personal property or, you know, government property. These lines are very, very important. And it kind of, I felt it. And so this is kind of the point of start for me. And so that's where I am. And I'm really, you know, open to conversation with you in terms of how you feel about sort of, you know, the notion of property, sovereignty, and living here on this land of Serrano, Cahuilla, and Chemehuevi people. And how do you deal with that? And so that is my sketch, and I think I'll end here.
Are there any questions or comments?
Jinny, can you maybe explain how this relates to what you were talking about, the water?
Sure. So, you know, of course, I was thinking about this kind of very geometric delineation of property that happened here that really, it always strikes me to look at this map, and Bernard forwarded me this map of property around the San Bernardino county property map. And it's always really shocking to see these colonial lines really divided. I mean, even between Canada and US, it's like, you know, and of course the indigenous people, it's not, I mean, there are people whose land is like between the border, land border as well. And so, those geometric lines really always strikes me as artificial, but it is something that also keeps peace in certain way. And so it's very kind of difficult to make some kind of like position on that line. So I wanted to kind of think about the more natural kind of formation onto which there is this geometric border that keeps being drawn, because I drew it with water. I didn't want to do anything with that kind of would leave things behind. And so I used what was around. And so these sand, is that how you call it here? Sand, which come from the rocks. And so it has, they're like amalgamation of many different entities that actually come from a large entity, but now they're forming a shape onto which I keep drawing these like water line, some kind of border that sometimes it's contained, but sometimes it's not. Is something that I was thinking when I did that, and also just a sketch. And so this gesture of that I have to do to keep this border, this property line intact. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about that. Yes.
Hi. So just to clarify, have you been redrawing in the exact same place, or have you been redrawing it in different places, different orientations in relation to the circle?
I've been drawing in the same way, actually, on the same line, and it keeps disappearing, and I keep drawing, but that's a really interesting thought.
Yeah, well, I keep looking at this, and I was staring at it and realizing it was not exactly the same. And I can't really see that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my idea was a circle and a square, which is something that I always kind of find fascinating because I think forms are really fascinating. And so fitting circle into square or fitting square into circle or not fitting is something that I've been thinking, and how does that work? Is so there's different iterations of, you know, rectangles and squares within or without the circle. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of the disappearing, but because, yeah, it just makes me think of how we think that lines are so permanent and have always been there, and borders have always been there. But if it slightly moves, you know, but that's kind of what happens in geography around that too. Like you forget what was there before, and then a new line is run, and you think it was always there.
But also, I mean, you know, sand is also, I mean, I was looking at Jake walking on the water and making these footprints, and then this nice young lady kind of playing with the sand, and so that also is kind of shifting. And I don't know, I think I also like stability and permanence, and I think that is a rather colonial way of thinking about things and wanting things to be that way. But of course, you know, nothing is, and so I don't know. Yeah.
Actually, related to that, could you talk about the broken piece and the potential project? Because I think it's related to this.
Right. So, you know, the Perpetual Guest glass piece that I showed, while it was in exhibition, somebody walked on it. And so I get a call on like a Friday afternoon at 2 from the museum, and I'm like, this can't be good. And so of course it was broken. I was like, but then I asked them to keep all the pieces, and so I got them back. And after a few months of it sitting in the box and me feeling kind of okay about opening it, because I was a bit heartbroken, I started to piece them together. And I actually have all the pieces, like, and they're like really broken into, I would say, hundreds of pieces. And so I think it's interesting that somebody walked on it, broke it, because it is what we're doing in a way. So trying to piece it together, and I did put it together over the summer, little by little. And then I don't know what to do with it, but it does, I think I wanted to, while I was piecing it together, I was thinking about this idea of reparation, it being broken and then repairing. And then of course, you know, with this human hubris, I said, let's repair the broken relationship, you know. Then I thought a bit more, and for reparation, which implies an original state that was good, which was the case for my work, because I made it, it was good. I stopped because it was good. And then it was broken, and by piecing it together, I'm trying to put it back together. So it's a way of repairing. Whereas for me living here as an uninvited guest, there was never a good state. You know, we came and we occupy, take space. And so what does it mean to repair this relationship? I don't know, because it's not going back, because it's not like, you know, in Canada anyways, 35 million people just like they leave the country and become another displaced people joining the other 90 million people in the world. And so then what, right? So that incident at the museum made me think about this idea, and I don't know where I'm going with it, but it is an idea that, and I always kind of work with how material speaks to me, and then I get answers from material. It sounds corny, but it's kind of really true. And so, yeah, I'm kind of thinking about that. It's sitting in the studio, my studio. I don't know what to do with it, how to deal with it. But I've been thinking about this idea of reparation, mending, fixing. And then I was talking with Eli Hurdle, who was also here, I think, a couple of times. And I'm going to have a show at Open Space, which is an artist run center that where Eli works. And so I was kind of talking to him about this, and to also Toby Lawrence, who's also co-curating the show. And Eli, being an Indigenous person from that area, he was telling me about, you know, this Truth and Reconciliation report that Canada produced. And reconciliation, so some of my Indigenous friends have problem with this word reconciliation, because there was never a conciliatory state. So reconciling, what does that mean? And so Eli told me about how he focuses on the truth in that Truth and Reconciliation formula. So I don't know where I'm going to go with it. That's also kind of an open question that's sort of sitting. And so, yeah, that's what it is.
No, thank you very much. This whole idea of perfect to go back to, like returning to perfection for us was very appealing, but also that it's a call to finding a way to live well with the situation now, finding a way to cohabitate and bridge, which brings us full circle. But thank you. Are there any other questions or?
Kind of an observation question that your installation, the painting, I think that's a really rich, kind of really complex idea of using paint because you're an artist, but that also looks like staining. And I mean, there's all these negative kinds of connotations as well to the way that they mass. So I think of stain, I think of flies, so I think that's it's a really complex choice of material and form.
It's fun to get material to talk with me, converse in the studio. They do give me answers sometimes, not all the time. Yeah. Thank you.
So since you've been visiting the Morongo Basin and being in Joshua Tree, do you feel like this area has a different understanding of property than Ottawa, where you live?
It felt like that. I think it might, I have a feeling that it might be the West-East thing. The kind of this kind of frontier pioneering spirit kind of living here, because when I did a residency in the Yukon at Dawson City, the land of Chondequichin people, I also felt among settlers this kind of pioneering frontier kind of attitude that was just kind of there in the air. And I felt the same when I got here. But it's not something that is very strong, but also because I live in an urban area, so it's a bit of a very different kind of, way of thinking about land. But here I did feel that. So yes, I feel it's different. Yes.
Make a comment about something?
Sure.
All right, so early, the first part that you showed, and you talked about the birds, and I did want to say that that whole movie was about birds attacking people, right?
Yeah.
But it was revenge because of how humans treat birds.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I think, I do think about, you're talking about indigenous people who were on the land before, and then settlers come and displace through violence. And the fear that the settlers always have that there's going to be some kind of revenge, equal violence, because they can't think about, it's almost like that's how they think. They think, I took it from you.
Yeah.
And so instead of us sharing,
Yeah.
you're just going to take it from me. So
Right.
that's what I thought.
This is very interesting. This is very interesting. There's a text by George Orwell, where he talks about Moroccans, I think, and the colonization there, and it kind of describes why people there are so invisible, and they are just seen as labor and not as people. And it ends by saying how many there are and how little the whites are, and this fear of the revolt. When the arms are raised, what will we do is kind of, it's a very kind of interesting text, but absolutely, yeah, I think that's a very interesting observation. And when I talk to elders in Algonquin elders, and I had the privilege to talk to a couple there, it's not about that. This idea of revenge and so on, I think is also quite cultural specific. And there's also this idea of wampum belt by in the region where I come from. This wampum belt is basically like a belt. It's a contract. It's not a written contract, but it is a contract. They're usually made of beads, and it's basically two lines. And it's this principle of non-interference. And so, coexistence, non-interference. And you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's a really different kind of way of thinking about existence. Yes.
Yeah, just picking up on your point, there's a big debate now, I think, happening in the country along those lines, because, the fear, the United States in some years will be a majority people of color country. And that whole fear that you just talked about of feeling, well, those of us, well, me, I'm from the Caribbean, so that's a whole other story. Barbados in particular. There is that fear that somehow, because of not only how we were treated, the other, but in some ways still being treated, that we'll turn around and treat people in the same way. And you're absolutely right. I don't think that has occurred to anybody except people who have this fear of holding on, of this country having to remain, majority, majority white Christian, whatever. So I think it's a very interesting conversation that you're having and expressing in your art, and thinking about these things and thinking about repairing and what that could look like, which we don't know. We're finding our way to it, right? Just like democracy, we're finding our way to it. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that, because that has a huge impact now. on what's happening on a lot of different levels in this country. Yes.
And beyond.
And beyond, I'm sure. Yeah,
Thank you for that comment.
yeah.
Maybe if you pour sand on the sand, that'll look more better.
If I pour sand on the sand? You want more sand on the circle? Okay, maybe we can try that.
Well, Jinny, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing this really timely discussion and for your time here. And we really look forward to seeing the next phase of the work. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.